baritone. So our work goes back into the 90s with Sylvia. So anyway, this was an extraordinary event. I mean, there was at least 18 other guest performers. Okay, we're starting now. Are we on? Okay, we're not. Again, this is we're not on the cutting edge of the information age. There's advantages to that, of course. We haven't been taken out by Susnex or other computer viruses, at least that I know of. My name is Brian Lance. This is the meeting for the Schiller Institute and also LaRouche PAC supporters. This is Houston, Texas. This is July 1st, 2017, and I thank you for being here. I'm glad you're here for this meeting. This is July 1st, so in a few days we have July 4th. We have our holiday, our anniversary, shall we say, of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So we're going to discuss some of the critical ideas that led up to 1776. In fact, 150 years, really close to 150 years in terms of the period that led up to that the beginning of the American Revolution, which most Americans know very, very little about. So I'll come back to that as the main body of what we're presenting here today. Let me first give you, as we always do, an update on the strategic picture. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, this afternoon commented that the world, of course, is, as I say, of course, because I think you recognize it, is a very tense place right now. Unlike the countdown to the last G20 summit that occurred in China, leading into the really important G20 summit a week from now, we have a whole range of undecided questions, including the presidency of Donald Trump. The president is facing a coup attempt, ongoing coup originating out of London. So our remarks on the Declaration of Independence of the United States from Britain in 1776 is appropriate for that reason as well. Of course, there's the unanswered broader question: will President Trump succeed as president in building an alliance, a four powers alliance with Russia, China, and India? An alliance that LaRouche has called for decades, and really echoes the alliance of powers that defeated fascism. But in this case, as LaRouche has called for it, it's to finally defeat the British Empire itself. For some people, that's a seemingly invisible empire, but in fact, it's right in front of your nose. The G20 summit. The G20 summit next weekend, actually the 7th and 8th, I believe, is a critical juncture. You will have Donald Trump, President Trump. You will have President Xi of China. You will have President Putin of Russia. You will have President or Prime Minister Abe of Japan. You will have President Modi of India. The leaders, the major leaders in the world. President Trump is now public. National Security Director McMaster announced it the other day. Trump and President Putin, President Trump and President Putin will meet at the G20 summit. It's not going to kind of be a pass by in the hallway, shaking hands, hi, how are you, and so forth. It's going to be of substance. And as well, President Trump will meet again with President Xi Jinping of China. And you can imagine a whole wide array of meetings will occur at that summit. They really, I think, as far as we can say right now, the outcome of the summit will be more in terms of these meetings, particularly the Trump-Putin meeting, than in the G20 process itself, because the G20 is dysfunctional as a body. And President or Chancellor Merkel of Germany, who's leading the summit this year, it moves from country to country each year, is committed to a doctrine of green policies, decarbonization, denuclearization, and on and on and on. A Malthusian policy. It's a London direct import from London policy, which is, of course, completely contrary to the whole direction which the Belt and Road Initiative of China and other similar overlapping initiatives are taking the world. So the question is, will the world break finally with this environment of economic crisis and war, or will it fold? And that's why these meetings between key national leaders, leaders of nations, as opposed to international bodies or consortia or groupings, is so important, because the real question is leaders of nations meeting in dialogue. That's where the breakthroughs can and should happen. So that's what we're going into. Now, a measure of how important all of this is should be developments in this last week and a half. You saw, I'm sure you saw, suddenly there were reports coming out of certain people in the Trump administration that there was new evidence that Syria was about to carry out attacks against its own people with gas, sarin gas or otherwise. And a warning was made through the spokesman of President Trump, Spicer, that President Assad of Syria and Syria would pay heavily if they carried out such an attack. Now, immediately, President Putin and Russia, the Russian foreign minister and so forth, responded. President Assad of Syria and the Syrian government responded, and we responded to say, no, this is a setup. And you can imagine the different forms, because as the Russians pointed out, this is like giving a green light to the very circles, the jihadist networks and their supporters, that they can now carry out a gas attack, which, of course, the evidence has been presented many times that they've been responsible for, and blame it on the Syrian government, and then inviting thereby another attack on Syria. And of course, this would blow up the G20 summit. It might blow up a lot more than that too. So this was in the air. And then towards the end of the week, if you caught it, Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, announced that new evidence, all of course of this, no evidence was presented, that what had been apparent before had been discontinued, that the threat of gas attacks by the Syrian government no longer existed, and so essentially, in so many words, the mini crisis was over. So you can imagine, I mean, behind the scenes, and of course the British, Defense Minister Fallon of Britain in particular, were, waving those pom-poms and doing those dances, and hoping that Trump would get carried off, into another confrontation in Syria. But that's, as I said, that apparently has blown over. But this is the kind of thing that's going on. Importantly, and I just want to mention this because it's something for you to look up, get online and look up. The investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize winner, the man who exposed the My Lai massacre, when he was still at the New York Times, when the New York Times was still an actual newspaper of some sort, as opposed to the failure it is now. Seymour Hersh had published, and he could only get it published in Die Welt, but got it published in the German daily newspaper Die Welt in English and German, a whole intensive, detailed report on the phony story of Syria's gas attack in northern Syria of some months ago. Just so you understand, the London publication, the London Book Review, isn't it?
Review of books.
Yeah, London Review of Books. Thank you. Had sponsored him in preparing this research report. Hersh is known for his detailed work and his insider position in the military community, intelligence community, built up over decades. And he, in the course of this research, presented to the London Review of Books the sources for his story. Sources that are not revealed in the article, but were revealed by agreement to the London Review of Books to confirm, that what he, his sources were real sources, as opposed to what we get, every day of the week in the fake news media, mass media. But then the London Review of Books said, nope, this is too dangerous. We don't want to look like we're backing the Ruskies. And so Seymour Hersh had to go shopping to find someone in the world that would publish this detailed account. So it's well worth looking up, but it's Die Welt, D-I-E-W-E-L-T is how it's spelled. And if you need a link, let us know. But if you're someone that wants to kind of work this material through for yourself, it's definitely out there. And his publication of this was a real shot across the bow of the war drive effort. That came out, and obviously not accidentally, came out right in the middle of this whole countdown towards the G20 summit. So that was a very important development. Also, you probably have noted that CNN was caught spreading fake news and had to retract their story on Russian connections to certain investment companies, and then one of their own producers on camera explained how what CNN was producing on Russia and Russian spying and Russian manipulation of the election was, was hooey. I'll just put it that way. And they were doing it. His explanation was that they made their determination of these stories simply on the basis of driving ratings and therefore driving a revenue stream, which is, of course, is not the complete story, but nonetheless, that's been out and circulating over the last week. Now, finally, New York City, and you can put up the first slide if that works here. New York City, we had a presentation here a couple weeks back on the looming summer of hell in New York City and the broader breakdown of the transportation grid in the larger New York metropolitan region. What's up here now, and I think it's on camera, is just a look at Manhattan, which is obviously just, most people think New York City is Manhattan, but anyway, it's just a small part of New York City as a whole. But what you see here largely, particularly running north-south, are the subway lines of New York City. And you probably read they had a derailment, literally going off the rails of these subway cars. Over 37 people, at least the last count I saw, had been injured. And now the governor of the state, Cuomo, has declared an emergency in terms of the New York Transit Authority, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, MTA, and offered $1 billion in aid to get things straightened out. Well, as we know, the breakdown of the New York metropolitan system, the subway system's 100 years old. The metropolitan subway system is complete is, overutilized, built to handle far less than it's currently carrying, and is part of a general breakdown of not only the subways, but the rail systems, the lines coming in across the Hudson River, coming across the East River, and $1 billion is not serious. And this, of course, is part of the problem. It's part of a larger problem. But there it is. It's now occurring. And on July 10th, lines into Penn Central, 3 at a time, begin closing down over the course of the summer, which means that hundreds of thousands of people will not be able to get in on the subway, and that means they have to find alternate means of transport to work, and then out from work back home in the evening, and the rest of the system is already jammed. I mean, the bridges, the transport systems, the joke has been made, people can and it was proposed that people use Uber and so forth, but Lyft, Uber, whatever, but the point is, if you get in these vehicles, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be stuck on the bridges. They're going to be stuck on the highways. It's a nightmare, a summer of hell. So it begs the solutions which we're going to be discussing today. Just a couple of other developments very quickly. South Korean companies have pledged $12.8 billion in investments into the United States over this next 5 years. The president of Korea, the newly elected president of Korea, has been in Washington meeting with President Trump over the last few days, and that's an important development. President Kissinger, who's been having discussions with President Trump, has been in Moscow over the last several days for meetings there, including with President Putin. So there are at least relatively saner elements involved in U.S.-Russia relations that certainly can be mobilized to support the kind of initiative that Trump has shown himself to be open to, which is this four powers approach of Mr. LaRouche, which is what we have developing around the Belt and Road Initiative in particular. So let me just stop and just ask if there's any really important questions at this point bearing directly on what I've just said before moving on.
Just a correction. Oh. Kissinger is only president of Kissinger Associates.
What did I say he was?
President Kissinger.
President Kissinger. Well, thank God. No. Although you might argue that
he was.
Yeah, he was at one point. At one point, he said he kept the British government better informed than he kept the president. So exactly. Who was actually running the country at that point? That was back at the time of Nixon and Ford. No, it's a good point. I'm glad you corrected that misstatement. Yes, Ted.
So you mentioned the rail lines were coming in. We're going to be shut down on the 10th of July.
Beginning, yeah, for repairs, yeah.
For repairs.
Yeah. You have to shut down 3 rails at a time because you got the rail that you got to repair, and you got to move materials in on one rail, and you got to move the garbage that you're hauling out on the other. So 3 rails. There's like 25. I could be corrected, but it's roughly 25 lines into or rail lines into Penn Central now. So 3 at a time will be closed, and those rail lines.
Out of 25.
Out of 25.
That's still a problem.
Yeah.
Major.
Major problem.
People can go back and look at your video. It's on the Shillertex website.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yep.
They said it's going to disrupt 20% of those traveling.
Mm-hmm. 20% of those traveling will be disrupted. Very large number. And again, that's the Long Island rail line, the east, what are called the East River tunnels. There's actually like almost a dozen tunnels, but the East River tunnels are a set of tunnels, a specific set of tunnels. Those are going to be closed down one at a time, starting middle of next year for several years. And those tunnels are close to 100 years old. And the Hudson River tunnels from the other side coming in from New Jersey, they're over 100 years old. Amtrak says they're going to have to close those regardless within 15 years because they're unsafe. And within 15 years, they're beyond unsafe. I mean, at any moment, they could collapse.
There's a Hackensack River Bridge.
Okay, and then there's the Hackensack. We could go on and on and on here. Okay, all right, so I'm just gonna move on here. But what I'm gonna discuss now, keep in mind the broader context, because the question is, how do we solve a certain kind of riddle? How do we get mankind onto another pathway? We're making the point, Helga Zepp-LaRouche is making the point that that new renaissance is already in process, has already begun with the Belt and Road Initiative. The collaboration of over 70 countries, over half the world's population now, reaching all the way across Eurasia into Africa, now into the Americas, that's underway. But without the United States, the glue won't hold. It won't be pulled together. If we're on the other side of the fence fighting this thing, then you know, we're headed into the kind of disaster of New York, and we're headed into the kind of disasters that loom in terms of Syria, but in spades. So let me just start out. There's Linda LaRouche wrote a paper in June, late June, so it was really in preparation for July 4th of 2013. And it was directed to our staff in international economic policy, but it was titled "The Great Ontological Paradox." And what he was pointing to was that there had, well, I'll just give you the first sentence of it here. He says, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had survived up to a certain point in spite of the Anglo-Dutch tyranny's murderous crushing of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony's pine tree shelling system. And we're going to discuss that. And then he goes on to point out that this system had worked, and through the likes of Benjamin Franklin, this has gone on to become the basis of the American system of the policies of Alexander Hamilton and the Hamiltonian Revolution, the national bank policy, the national credit policy, the building of the United States as a sovereign republic, and had fulfilled the potential of the Constitution. But why, he asks, and how, he asks, has this been forgotten today? What is the secret to this, I'm paraphrasing here, of this, what happened? You know, why are we in the mess we're in? The lessons were learned, they were known. What are these lessons for today? And he poses it at one point from the standpoint of Kepler, Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer, and what Kepler called the vicarious hypothesis. That's what's required to understand the American system. Again, I'm paraphrasing. Is the vicarious hypothesis of the sort that Kepler made to discover the orbit of Mars, the actual elliptical orbit of Mars, and then the harmonic ordering of the solar system. So with that, I'm going to jump in to this, to the American Revolution, which started, you could say, around 1630, which happened to be, I believe, the year that Johannes Kepler passed away, ironically. So you could say that he handed it off, his task, to John Winthrop. And those that founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So 1630, I mean, think about what's going on. In Europe is the 30 Years' War. It's not even half over, which reduced in half the number of parishes in Europe. You know, the slaughter of Catholic against Protestant and vice versa. So it's in this context, and the deepening crisis in England that was not so directly involved in the 30 Years' War per se, that John Winthrop and other Puritans, a branch of Protestantism, that's at least how we would think of it today, decided that they had to set off for the New World. So let me just read here first just a flavor of this from John Winthrop. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go from John Winthrop up through Benjamin Franklin. But Benjamin Franklin only up until before the American Revolution. And we're going to kind of explore an answer to the riddle. And at the same time, really, I hope, make clearer in a new way the Belt and Road Initiative and the necessary kind of mechanisms that have to be created today for the rebuilding of the United States. So here's John Winthrop. This was written in approximately 1629. It's called General Considerations for the Plantation of New England. And I'm just going to read a couple of points there, what we would today call bullet points. The second is, all other churches of Europe are brought to desolation, and it cannot be feared like judgment is coming upon us, but be feared the judgment is coming upon us. And who knows but that God hath provided this plan to be a refuge for many whom free means to save out of the general destruction. The next, this land grows weary of her inhabitants, so that man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here made vile and baser than the earth they tread on. So as children, neighbors, and friends, especially of the poor, are counted the greatest of burdens, which if things were right, would be the highest earthly blessings. Sound familiar? And then here in the affirmative, this is his sixth point for consideration. This was circulated to recruit for this effort. The whole earth is the garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men to be filled and improved by them. Why then should we stand starving here for places of habitation, many men spending as much labor and cost to recover or keep sometime only an acre or two of ground, as would procure him many hundreds of acres, as good or better in another place? And in the meantime suffer whole countries as fruitful in lie waste without any improvement. So I think I'll leave it at that. It's very short, and it's worth looking up. John Winthrop, 1629. Now, there was quite an effort made by the Puritans, and the Puritans were not some powerful group per se in England, but the crown of England, the royal power was crumbling at the time. We're just short of the Cromwellian Revolution. And under those conditions, what Winthrop and his collaborators were able to do was they were able to get a charter from the king to set up a plantation, a colony in the New World, and to set it up and move the headquarters for the colony from London to the New World. So that it could be ruled, if you will, from the New World itself. And this was a complete break, and probably partly a result of a distraction on the part of the king, Charles I. Probably also he was currying some favor, somehow in the factional situation that it existed in. But that was 1629, and the following year, less than a year later, Winthrop set sail. Now, there'd already been some earlier ventures, a few people here and there, searching out sites and so on. But 300 people sailed in that first set of ships. And in the course of the next year or two, 15,000 people. Well, it was 2,000 within roughly a year. But within, say, a decade or so, it was 15,000 people who had arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Boston was an outcome, other cities reaching all the way up to Dover, and then Connecticut, the Connecticut area, and expanded beyond.
To the moon.
To the moon, yes. It was a moonshot. And if you think about, I mean, the incredible, the 300 people were chosen specifically for their skills. Bricklaying, shipbuilding, surveyors, because towns had to be laid out. You know, this was not some, you know, kind of, this was not shooting a can to the Mars, a can to the Mars one way, you know, and hope giving you your best goodbye, you know. This was a serious effort by very serious people,
Who chose
competent people.
Who chose the 300?
Well,
Was it a royal decision?
no. This was Winthrop and his circles. They recruited
They
people.
decided on-
They collaborated, and then of course after the first 300, more were brought over. Yeah.
Need some of this, are these some of the slides?
Oh yeah. Do you have them up? Okay.
Yeah, they're just not being broadcast. For some reason, I can't get them linked.
Okay. Well, sorry for the audience. We'll continue the discussion here. But this is a photograph of John Winthrop, just so you have an idea of what he looks like. Perhaps that can be picked up on the screen from the camera as well. Okay, so at least you get an impression, and you can Google John Winthrop under images, and you know, take a look at him there as well.
What year was that picture?
I don't know. We're not going to get anywhere if we keep getting lots of comments like this, questions like this. I got to move on here. Hold the questions to the end. That's the way it's always put. But also, I mean, within the years of landing in the Massachusetts Bay, Harvard University was created, Harvard College. The question of educating, just in terms of background, an important feature of the Puritans was, and among Protestants more generally, this seemed to be the case, but the Puritans were a specific case. They believed that the Bible had to be read and thereby revealed to the reader, that reading was a necessary part of one's Christian faith. And you know, that could be said for Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth in ways as well. But the point is that this is, so there, as opposed to a priest, an Anglican priest, for example, reading sections of the Bible to an illiterate population, which was the normal standard fare. Instead, the point was you had to become educated and you had to study the Bible yourself. And those that were chosen had been self-selected by God, had been selected by God because they had the religion had revealed itself to them, right? So this question of education, I'm just saying, is a very important aspect and played a very important role in the development of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and of Connecticut. And if you want to look forward, the regular line of the Continental Army, 70% of it came from Massachusetts and Connecticut. For the whole, I'm talking about the whole war. So it gives you a sense of the importance of this process. So you have the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You also had to develop, of course, industry. You had to develop production, shipbuilding. At the time, tall poles, timbers from the New World were being shipped back to England. It was a major export because you could no longer get those tall trees in England. They'd all been cut down. You know, this is part of the collapse of Britain at the time. Was just in terms of it was using itself up. It was cannibalizing itself up. But also iron. The production of iron was incredibly important, and therefore we had the Sargus Ironworks. I think that's the next slide, is it, Belinda? Yeah. Built near Sargus, what became Sargus, Massachusetts. There was actually a couple of these as this process was worked out. But the Sargus Ironworks were the largest complex. Rolling mills, forges. It wasn't just the production of pig iron. in the world at the time that it was constructed. John Winthrop Jr., himself a leading figure, was sent back to England and on to the continent for, among other things, besides intelligence purposes otherwise, to get the best knowledge from the lowlands in particular on the production of these kinds of facilities. So the Sargas Iron Works was the outcome of this. And this is the first example of national credit. There was nobody to borrow money from, or very few people to borrow money from in the New World. There were people that were willing to invest back in England, Puritans who were willing, and Puritans were notorious for their tightness with money. They were willing to invest if they thought it was a good proposition. But nonetheless, for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for the court, the general court which is what it was called, and it's what the legislature is still called in Massachusetts, the general court, determined was that they had to provide a form of what we would call today credit, what Hamilton would later understand to be credit, for the development of the Sargas Iron Works. And this is a very important part of what I'm going to be developing today, as opposed to trying to give you a whole history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But just to run through a few items here. The general court extended to the company of undertakers of the Sargas Iron Works that they had first a 21-year monopoly on iron manufacture in the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. Secondly, the company was granted land, not only for the area around the iron works, which was 3 square miles, but also other parcels of common land belonging to Massachusetts, or to the various towns. So therefore they could, and what could they use this land for? They could harvest timber for it, for the forages, right? For the blast furnaces, if you will. Going further on, the company had access to private land with the owner's permission to scout for iron deposits. The company was required to fulfill all of the colony's requirements for iron before it could export any, and the price was capped at 20 pounds per whatever ton or whatever the measurement was at the time, which was a sticking point with the financiers of the Sargas Iron Works. You can imagine they wanted that cap removed, and they wanted to be able to export when the demand was right. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony just refused to budge. You know, they stood their ground. Also related to this, anyone that found a mine, developed a mine, discovered a mine, got a 20 years tax-free on the development of that mine. So these are the kinds of credit mechanisms. In other words, from the future, you're saying, okay, if you do these things, right, we're granting you the following advantages, right, to carry forward the project. The company itself was granted 10 years freedom from taxes, the Sargas Iron Works itself. And the company had rights to ore, water power, timber, and building materials which were located on the common lands. So does that give you a sense of what I mean by credit in this sense? It wasn't that they were extended currency, money, but they were given the equivalent under the conditions. Now, that brings us to another point, which was, well, let me develop a couple of other points here as well. Now, this was not occurring in a vacuum. Within 2 years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony began setting up in 2030, well, 4 years. 4 years later, in 1634, the King's Privy Council, you've heard of the Privy Council, many of you. The Queen's Privy Council is the center of power to this day. The Privy Council demanded the charter back. All right. Now, in the meantime, John Winthrop and friends had already imported over, even in the original ships, 8 cannon, and they had added to it since. And of course, they were developing the Sargas ironworks later on. But you can see becomes another feature of why you need ironworks. But they immediately began the preparation for the defense of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 4 years after this, in 1638, the demand came again with the threat that the king would essentially come and occupy all the lands, take power over all the lands. In the meantime, fortifications had been built up. John Winthrop Jr., that was one of his tasks, was to comprehend, to survey existing fortifications in Europe, including in England, which he had gained access to before he left, very openly in that case. But all of this preparation. So my point here is, we didn't make the American Revolution out of, yes, in 1776. They were prepared in 1638, if not 1634, to declare their independence if necessary from the crown, and go it alone, you know, and fight it out. So of course this led to a back down on the part of the British Crown, but this also led to the creation of, in 1638, of the militia, of the Military Company of Massachusetts, and then within that there was, for example, the 1st Massachusetts Regiment of Militia, 1,000 men, which was headed by John Winthrop himself. This is the beginning of the Continental Army.
How many men?
One unit, the 1st Massachusetts Regiment, was 1,000 men. So this is the beginning of literally of the Continental Army, of the main line of the Continental Army. And in 1643, the New England Confederation was announced, which was the forerunner of the initial Confederation of the United States after the American Revolution. That was Massachusetts, Connecticut River settlements all the way up to Dover. So that was in 1643. Now in 1652, the Mint was opened. And there's a story there, and it's an important story, and it comes up again and again, because the problem for the colony of Massachusetts, but also for the other colonies that followed, was the shortage of species of gold and silver, which was the money, the so-called real money of the time. And I think this is not abstract. I mean, it should not be abstract. Right now we're dealing with Republicans as well as Democrats who are saying, well, we can't spend it because we don't have the money. All right? We've still got this problem. This is what Lynn is talking about in terms of this question of making the discovery, you know, the elevated standpoint from which to comprehend and solve a problem, which otherwise you're trapped in without a solution. The problem was the silver, primarily it was silver, was being drained out of the colonies, out of Massachusetts, because they didn't produce all that they needed. They needed to import from England, and the balance of trade, if you will, was not in the colony's favor. In other words, it was a colony. It was being treated like Britain always treats its colonies up to this day, which is through a manipulation of exchange rates and so on and so on. In this case, it wasn't manipulation of exchange rates, but today it still takes this form. IMF conditionalities and so on. The third and fourth worlds have been turned into the third and fourth worlds, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is overcoming. But this has been in place for a long time, if you get my drift. So the question was, why could you? Nobody had any money. You're there in the colonies, but the silver is leaving. There's less and less money day after day, week after week, year after year. They're making all kinds of attempts to salvage their position, but you know, they're being drained dry. So the decision is made, to begin with, the decision, and you will have a handout here, those of you who are here. You can read it later, but it's the order, one of the, it's a reprint, if you will, of one of the original orders creating a mint for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they took existing sources of silver, they paid people for it, or worked out a barter agreement. You know, people's silverware, anything with silver in it, right? Didn't have to be, 100% silver or whatever. They took it and they used it and they melted it down, and it wasn't 100% silver, right? It was diluted in that sense, right? Because they were stretching it, and created the pine tree shelling, right? And began to circulate this as the currency in the colonies. And this later became then the basis for a paper script, right? As you can imagine, the next step is once you get the idea, once you see the discovery, once you make the discovery, right, that you can circulate. If you have a circulating medium, it doesn't matter what it is made of itself. It's the whole country, as we'll hear Cotton Mather say later, that backs up the circulating medium. And so if that medium is circulating in a whole country that's going somewhere, that's developing and growing and expanding, that currency is as good as gold, to coin a phrase. So, so the mint began in 1652. You can imagine the crown was beside itself. There were orders to stop the production of the shelling. They even had a hard time holding on to the shillings because as far away as Barbados and so on and so forth in the Caribbean, they were quite willing to accept these shillings in trade because they needed currency as well, right, for their own purposes. But there was a reprieve of sorts, and that is that in 1653, Cromwell takes power. The Commonwealth is created in England. It only lasts 10 years. But nonetheless, there is the overthrow of Charles I. He's executed. Cromwell forms the Commonwealth, which is more aligned with the Puritans. They're among the factions involved in the new government in England, sometimes referred to as a republic. And so the problems, the immediate problems for a short period abated. But the people from England continued to come, because a new world was opening up, right? And the colony of Massachusetts wanted to maintain its independence. It was asked, might you give up your charter and rejoin the mother country now that we have a new government and a commonwealth? Well, we're happy with our, with what we have and so on and so forth. And it was diplomatically handled. But the point is, they continued on their merry way. So I don't want to jump ahead too fast. Skipping over a few things, of course, the Indian Wars, so-called Indian Wars. Now, this was a continued problem from the get-go. And these were not Indian Wars. These were orchestrated by the British Crown in cahoots with the French government and the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church of the time, operating out of the French colonies, out of Canada in particular, right? And these Indian War operations were constantly utilized to try to break the colonies. Connecticut was heavily hit, but all the way down, within miles of Boston, these Indian raiding parties and so forth continued to come. And later on, by 1690, these were virtual invasions. British ships were caught, shipping arms, down the St. Lawrence Seaway, to the French. These weapons going to the Indians. I mean, this was,
Terrorism.
yeah, or, this was in your face. And yet it's little talked about regarding this whole history. And of course, this whole period of American history is not talked about much because it shines such a light on the actual processes involved. But let me just continue here. I want to bring forward another figure very briefly. By 1690, as I said, I mean, remember, 1691, you have the France and England are at war, but at the same time, the British are providing weapons to the French to give to the Indians. Right? Literally in 1701, William III, who has come to power, William III, William of Orange, of Dutch origin. Right? This is, there's a coup. The Dutch win out. You could say the Dutch East India Company wins out against the newly emerging British East India Company in terms of power, actual power, and takes over England. And this is who we have as William III. William III signs an agreement with the French for Iroquois neutrality. Now, the Iroquois Indians were the only major Indian tribe in the New England area that was allied otherwise with the colonies. So by declaring Iroquois neutrality, it let the barrier down, cleared the way for massive attacks. In the context of this, the colonies were forced to mobilize, and of course, in the meantime, the royal crown was now under William III was now reasserting its authority in the New World to crush the colonies. You had the Navigation Act, you had new taxes, you had all kinds of measures brought forward to crush and literally depopulate New England. So the colonialists were also under pressure to ally with the British against the Indians. Right? So armies were being raised up, or regiments, militia, and so forth, were being raised up to take on the French and the Indians in combat and deploy out into Western Pennsylvania, deploy into New England. I mean, this was beyond just the Massachusetts Bay itself. So the figure I want to bring forward is Cotton Mather. Now the Mathers are the continuation. Their photograph of this is Cotton Mather, and actually the next photo, if you can just switch to the next one, just to that's Increase Mather, the father, obviously at a younger age. But go back to Cotton Mather, that's fine. I just got him backwards there. The Mathers are leading lights of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, centered in Boston. Increase Mather is the head of Harvard University. He's a leading scientist. Increase Mather is in collaboration and contact with the circles of Milton, a correspondent with those circles, with Leibniz in continental Europe, an astronomer, actually invited to join the British society, the Royal Society, the Science Society of Britain. They were trying to keep an eye on him. And he was involved in secret missions back to London in the midst of the tumult of this overthrow and William III coming to power and so on and so forth. You can just imagine what was going on. His son, likewise, Cotton Mather, led the largest congregation in Boston and was a leading intellectual and scientist. And at age of 27 years old, he published some considerations on bills of credit, which is the next step in our story on this. And I'll just read a few excerpts from his writings. This is in the context of the Indian Wars, all right? And he has proposed, and obviously he's not gotten this idea out of the sky. de novo, right? He's been a collaborator of he's there in Boston. He's part of the Winthrop circles and so on and so forth. Here are some excerpts. I therefore cannot a little wonder at the great indiscretion of our countrymen who refuse to accept that which we call paper money as pay of equal value with the best Spanish silver. What? Is the word paper a scandal to them? Is a bond or bill of exchange of 1,000 other than paper? And yet, is it not as valuable as so much silver and gold, supposing the security of payment be sufficient? Now, what is the security of your paper money less than the credit of the whole country? All the inhabitants of the land, taken as one body, are the principals. If you require the country to pay their taxes in silver, when such quantity of it as is needful for that purpose cannot be had in the country, this were to require men to make bricks without straw. We need paper money, so long as they cannot keep silver in the country, which they will never do while the European trade continues. And that is like to be as long as we are a people. And he continues, and this is, this gets you the sense of the battle going on at this time. And let it be considered whether they who do decry out bills of credit do sufficiently weigh the desperate circumstances of the country. We are surrounded with adversaries. If we cannot find more of men to expose themselves for us at this time, no man in his wits can think the country can stand. These men, he's referring to soldiers, militia, who are being asked to go to fight in the Indian Wars, French and Indian Wars. These men must have money to reward and support them in their services, or they can do no more. But silver, we say, we have not. Credit we may have, and it will do as well if by this credit we permit our friends to command the same useful things as if they had already silver in their hands. Hence, to do anything to render these bills contemptible and unpassable is to effect to leave the country without all manner of defense against any that would prey upon us, which is a moral madness. We should upon no terms render ourselves guilty. Sound familiar? So this is Reverend Cotton Mather. And there's many more things that could be said about him and his contributions, scientific and otherwise. But this is a window into the conflict. Now you may ask, well, who would oppose this? Who would oppose it? Well, besides people not understanding the question of paper, and couldn't paper be devalued, and haven't there been instances when paper has been devalued? Because remember, there's been this ongoing brawl going on to maintain the colony and develop it. Well, think of the merchants. The merchants importing into the port of Boston, who then are turning around, and selling, right? They want silver for their trade with England, right? And as we'll see from Benjamin Franklin, they know that they have advantages in there being shortages maintained that ensure that the broader market has to rely on them. So that's an important feature of it to keep in mind. So this is the battle being fought out in terms of the financial side of a broader fight to build the nation. So now what I'd like to do is leap forward, I think, a bit um, to Pennsylvania. And there is really a handoff. I mentioned it very briefly. Boston was literally being depopulated. You can go, I did this 4 years ago, I guess I gave a presentation. It was at the time Lynn's paper came out on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, more in depth. And you can go through the population figures. Boston flatlines. It just stops growing. People are leaving because of the imposition of the new taxes, restrictions on trade, and so forth that are being imposed from England by the crown. You have revolts. You have Andros, who's appointed as the ruler over Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's basically thrown out on his ear. He's forced to surrender and leave the country, but he comes back, basically with a navy with him. So there's an ongoing battle going on. Well, at the same time, Philadelphia has become the center of the Pennsylvania colony, and it's actually not a colony. It's been created by other means. William Penn, actually, his father was owed a great deal of money by the crown, and they decided to pay him in 1681. Charles II, to pay debts, gave the territory of what became Pennsylvania to William Penn's father. And William Penn himself, as a young man, immediately headed off across the ocean, a Quaker family, and immediately set up shop, began designing a city, and that became Philadelphia. So that was 1682. So you had the setting up of Pennsylvania as not a colony of the crown, but as a privately run, company or property. And so the rules were different. They didn't apply. Now, so there, as I said, there was a handoff from Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was a collaborator of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, as you may know, started out in Boston. He moves down to Philadelphia, right? He's set it up a junto already of like-minded young men. He's done that by the time he's 21. He goes on to set up fire departments. He goes on to raise the first militia in Philadelphia. Quakers don't fight wars. They don't fight battles. They don't believe in war. But Franklin used his printing presses, his newspaper and so forth, to rally citizens to the cause, to call up a militia for the defense of Philadelphia and the defense of Pennsylvania. Again, a contribution towards what became the Continental Army in terms of how it worked. So Benjamin Franklin, just so you give an idea, is born in 1706. 1727, he's created the junto. They've created the library, lending library. This goes on to become a public library system and so forth and so on. In 1756, so he's 50 years old. He organizes the Regiment of Philadelphia against the Indian uprising. Again, these Indian deprivations continue, again manipulated, and so on. But the writing I want to bring to your attention right now, and these a couple of things from Franklin will close out my remarks here, is a modest inquiry. One of his modest inquiries. You can say it was modeled on Swift, I guess, Jonathan Swift. A modest inquiry into nature and necessity of a paper currency. And you see here, and he published it anonymously. But then later, in his autobiography, you can read, he'll tell you about it, that he wrote it and circulated it to very good effect. So I'm just going to draw on a few notes on it from here. In his autobiography, he says, I'm just going to read a few sentences. He says there in his autobiography, published years later, there was a cry among the people for more paper money. Only 15,000 pounds being extant in the province, and that's soon to be sunk gone, species. The wealthy inhabitants opposed any addition, being against all paper currency for the apprehension that it would depreciate as it had done in New England to the injury of all creditors. We had discussed this point in our junto, where I was on the side of an addition, being persuaded that the first small sum struck in 1723 had done much good by increasing the trade, employment, and number of inhabitants in the province, including the number of inhabitants. Since I now saw all the old homes uninhabited and many new ones building, whereas I remembered well when I first walked among the streets of Philadelphia, I saw many houses on Walnut Street and so forth to be let. Anyway, this kind of argument, well, therefore, we should expand the money supply, which they did. And he reports that the utility of these new currency printings, which he actually got the contract for, which he's quite proud of how that paid off for him.
Win-win.
Yeah, win-win. That's right. That's right. Good. He says the utility of this currency became, by time and experience, so evident that the principles upon which it was founded were never afterwards much disputed, so that it grew soon to 55,000 pounds, and in 1739 to 80,000 pounds. Trade, buildings, and inhabitants all the while increasing. So here's a few quotes from Benjamin Franklin at the tender age. Did I say 23? 1729. Yeah, 23 years old. Okay, so here we have. There is no science, the study of, which is more useful and commendable than the knowledge of the true interests of one's country. And perhaps there is no kind of learning more abstruse and intricate, more difficult to acquire in any degree of perfection than this, and therefore none more generally neglected. Much easier to have a Robinson Crusoe idea of the economy. Everyone just seeks their own pleasure and avoids pain, and somehow it'll all just work out. No. Franklin's saying, no, you've got it. There's a science here that has to be mastered. There is a certain proportionate quantity of money requisite to carry on the trade of a country freely and currently, more than which would be of no advantage in trade, and less, if much less, exceedingly detrimental to it. This leads us to the following general consideration. Now, this is a pamphlet being broadly circulated, right, in Philadelphia, under crisis conditions. A great want of money in any trading country occasions interest to be at a very high rate, and you can imagine how he develops that, I think. Secondly, want of money in a country reduces the price of that part of its produce which is used in trade, i.e. if people don't have money, they can't buy. Third, want of money in a country discourages laboring and handicraftsmen, who are the chief strength and support of a people, from coming to settle in it. I'm taking sentences out of this pamphlet. Now, though this extraordinary consumption of foreign commodities may be of profit to particular men, that is, since you're not producing yourself, you have to import it, right? Yet the country in general grows poorer by it apace. On the contrary, as a plentiful currency will occasion a less consumption of European goods in proportion to the number of the people, so will be a means of making the balance of our trade more equal than it now is, if it does not give it in our favor. Let me leave it at that. There's more here. He comments, you can imagine other features of it. And he was supported, actually, in circulating this, he was supported by the governor of Pennsylvania at that time. And now finally, just in 1764, this is in the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars, Franklin again defends the paper currency. At this point, the crown is breathing down heavily on the colonies. I mean, this is 1764, so we're in the lead up to the break. and the Declaration of Independence. So Franklin, in this case, is now in England, and he's addressing the Board of Trade directly, or actually he's addressing the Parliament, but he's addressing a report by the Board of Trade, which is calling for a further restraint on the emission of paper bills of credit in America as legal tender. That it should be prevented altogether as legal tender. That is, to pay your taxes, it's got to be in silver, right? And you can imagine to get the silver, farmers had to sell their land. You can imagine the kind, loan sharking kind of situation that this kind of thing sets up. But that's just a feature of it. But so he's addressing the parliamentary committee on this, again with the support of the Pownall administration of the colonies at that time, that this actually is necessary. So it's an interesting battle that's going on. Let me see, I just want to take one brief quote. New England, particularly in 1696, about the time they began the use of paper money, had in all of its 4 provinces but 130 churches or congregations. In 1760, they were 530. The number of farms and buildings there is increased in proportion to the numbers of people. And the goods exported to them from England in 1750, before the restraint took place, were nearly 5 times as much as before they had paper money. Pennsylvania, before it made any paper money, was totally stripped of its gold and silver, though they had from time to time, like the neighboring colonies, agreed to take gold and silver coins at higher and higher nominal values in hopes of drawing money into and retaining it for the internal use of the province. So let me just conclude with that. So he's arguing that even from a win-win standpoint, even England, benefited from the utilization of paper currency in the colonies, in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania in particular, which he's referring to here. But again, this goes to the heart of the beast, right? The beast is not interested in making money. The person who thinks that Wall Street, is in control and they wouldn't do anything that would actually cost them money, don't understand what where the beast actually lives. That the policy of Malthus, Parson Malthus of the East India Company, who called for the kinds of conditions. He literally stated, we had it the other day, it was brought up again fresh the other day, that he literally called for narrowing the streets in the poor areas of London and other cities, of creating conditions, worsening conditions, to increase the death rate, right? To eliminate the riffraff, a Hitlerian useless eaters policy, literally is what Malthus, as working for the British East India Company, called for as an economist. This is what happened to India. This is what they were intent on in the colonies, so this is what the Declaration of Independence is about. But not only negatively, I hope you have some insight into the tools that were uniquely developed, right, to create the conditions through the utilization of a credit system, based on the creative powers of the human mind, the creativity of men and women that could be unleashed, right? If recognizing that quality as a gift of God, shall we say, that provided the basis for winning the American Revolution, and those that principle, that insight is what we have to share with Americans, more Americans, including with the President Trump in his circles today. So that's what we're about today. The Belt and Road Initiative, to be won, is going to be won on the basis of Americans once again grasping what a credit system has to be. as opposed to a Federal Reserve policy or a monetarist policy or a budget balancing policy I mean, think of the healthcare debate. I mean, this is completely fraudulent the way it's currently posed in Congress and in the media and so on and so forth. If you take Hill-Burton, the laws that were put into place after World War II, the basis of Hill-Burton was to define the necessity of a certain number of hospital beds per capita, higher in rural areas because people are spread out, more dense in the cities, that had to be met. It had to be met by the local government. If they couldn't do it, then the county took care of it. If the county didn't take care of it, the state was mandated to take care of it. If the state couldn't take care of it in poor states like Mississippi and so on and so forth, then the federal government would step in various forms, teaching hospitals, veterans hospitals, you name it. But a certain number of manned hospital beds, that required a certain number of nurses, required a certain number of doctors. You start with the physics, the physical side, the physical capacity to provide health care. The question is the physical capacity, right, of pig iron, of rolling mills, to produce the cannon, to produce the farm implements. That's what you start with, and you create a financial system that gets you there. The future determines, the present. So let me conclude on that.
Yeah.
Was the mill in Boston capable of producing steel as well as just iron?
It's in Sargus. It's outside of Boston.
Sargus.
But what produce?
Was it able to produce steel?
No. I mentioned blast furnaces at one point. No, it did not produce steel. That came later. Sargus did not.
Imported in the United States up until 1700.
I couldn't speak to that. Perhaps Joel, do you know by any chance?
There wasn't really much steel.
Until later on.
It was for bills and kitchen.
Yeah, right. Good question, but I can't answer the question. Yep.
Could you just restate the difference of how paper currency worked in Ben Franklin's time compared to the quantitative easing?
Well, I think I'd rather leave it the way I did, because I really think you got to kind of roll it around in your mind and play with it, like putting yourself in the driver's seat, in terms of a science for the nation as a whole, as opposed to balancing your books, of your home budget or whatever. Let me just see if things unfold. Maybe I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Other questions? Well, to answer your question then, since that's where we're left. That seems to be holding everybody's breath. Look, let's take the current situation. What Mr. LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche are posing, and LaRouche is, of course, proposing it as the foremost physical economist of certainly the 20th century, 21st century so far, that what's required is the creation in the United States now of an infrastructure bank, or a national bank. He's calling for a national bank modeled on Alexander Hamilton. And it's interesting in terms of China. China does not have a Federal Reserve. It doesn't have a central bank in the sense of Federal Reserve. The question of monetary policy and so forth comes under the State Council. It comes under the leadership of the President and the State Council, the Standing Committee of the State Council and so forth. I just throw that out. How a national bank, as Hamilton created it, took in debt and utilized it as capital. As you may know, after the American Revolution, a great deal of debt was outstanding, held in the form of continentals, held in the form of IOUs of the states that the states had written, as well as the federal government. The saying was not worth a continental. that this had virtually no value because the country was bankrupt at the end of the American Revolution for all intents and purposes. Hamilton, in his sagacity and drawing on these conceptions of Mather and Franklin and back to the Winthrops, went further and said, all right, we will honor this debt. We as the United States, as a single unified nation, we will, in creating a national bank, take all of this debt that is owed by the United States. We will pay you for it. Pay into the national bank, and the national bank will issue national bank script paper, which is redeemable in land, or otherwise will pay an interest rate, approximately 5%. And he tied a revenue stream on imported alcoholic beverages, rum, and so on and so forth, certain other things. It was very limited as a revenue stream that would continue, as a revenue stream to be enough to honor the interest payments on this new paper put into circulation, these new national bank paper, right? Now the national bank paper then circulated as money throughout the new states, throughout the new nation. At the same time, the U.S. government deposited its money coming in from tax revenue sources, deposited into the new First National Bank of the United States. When it wasn't spending it, that's where it was. Well, while it was there, it could be lent out as loans, right? And so on and so forth. If the bank was also capitalized by the U.S. government. We got into the details of that before. It was a little bit of sleight of hand, but basically the bank was capitalized to the tune of a couple $1 million, which was a lot of money back in those days. So the bank then had a lending capacity. Now, of course, the point was that not Franklin himself, he was the Treasury Secretary, but those appointed to the bank to head the bank by the Congress then made decisions on the lending of that money. And the lending of the money, they were saner then. They understood that you had to lend money in ways that would be productive, that would grow the economy. I mean, there wasn't much slack. There wasn't much wiggle room in terms of decision making, and so those decisions resulted in a growing economy, a rapidly growing economy. The debt was all paid off in the course of a couple decades. All of that original debt was liquidated. The country was flourishing. So if you get from that idea, here is LaRouche saying, okay, we need a national bank. So we're going to look at all the debt the United States has, all owed all around the world, also held by Americans. Well, come to us and put your money into the bank. But the Japanese, they have a lot of U.S. government bonds. The Chinese have a great deal of U.S. debt. Come put it into the national bank, right? Put it in as capital into the bank. You'll get a return more than you're getting on your U.S. government bonds, which is virtually zero, right? So, offer them 4%, 5%, whatever. And then suddenly you have a national bank. You could also put the U.S. Highway Trust Fund, the transportation fund, into the bank, as a place of deposit and so on and so forth. That bank then can lend a multiple of that money in terms of long-term projects to rebuild the U.S. economy. So this is the way in which credit works. The key is not some automatic process. The key is a deliberative process. It's a determination that we will decide to invest in these areas. We will make these scientific, to go back to Franklin's terms, science, of a national economy, of a nation. We will make these scientific decisions, and we'll take responsibility for them, and therefore guarantee the future. So that's, if that helps. Yeah, Evelyn.
Well, it's also the reason, I think, in terms of your question, Betty, that you have to have Glass-Steagall as the first step to doing this. Because if you have Glass-Steagall and you take away government backing from all the speculative paper, it collapses, goes bankrupt, and you don't have to keep having a stream of money to cover for these phony debts. And therefore it allows you to issue new credit and not have it sucked into that speculative stream.
Right, good point.
I was just thinking, in terms of other sources for capitalization of this national bank, do we still have an export-import bank?
Not right now.
No.
They're trying to get it. They're trying to get it voted up again by the Congress. The Congress refused to renew it, so we don't have an export-import bank. What's financing, you know, those railroads in Africa? They're being built by the Chinese in collaboration with the nation of Kenya and Ethiopia, and so that's being financed by the China Export-Import Bank. I mean, you know, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face to not have it as a tool.
Right.
How it's used, that's again another question. That's part of why the Export-Import Bank was why the votes weren't there to keep it in operation. It was seen as simply helping a few people like Boeing, but not really helping the country as a whole.
I was just thinking that when you said Franklin was in England in the 1750, you know.
For 20 years he was there.
Yeah. But he was also in all the scientific circles and so they actually had a choice. Like Lynn's always said, it's a political economy. And so when the networks were closed down and knocked out in London, that, you know, he's also working with France and whatever. It's actually a global fight of the same manner and way we have today.
That's a good point.
And we have to understand the combination of that, because we have to actually knock out this enemy and actually pull it at this higher level, which is really the American Revolution. It's an international thing.
Here's a dumb question. It's like you mentioned, like, along about 1760 or so, the crown choking. Was it just the colonial economy down to the silver only, or was it the economy of England as well?
Well, it was I mean, you take the example of Hellfire clubs. Let me just point out, I wanted to mention earlier, this book, How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, H. Graham Lowry, you know, is the book. I mean, that goes through this history in detail, and original research. And we published this years ago. It's still available, Amazon.com.
We got 4 of them.
There are 4 of them here. You know, I think they're 1995. Anyway, just an incredible history. This is was to be volume 1, but it's the period 1630 through 1754. So just to mention, but in it, Graham, for example, develops the Hellfire clubs in London. I mean, debauchery. I mean, the worst story you ever heard about the Church of Satan or whatever, you know, doesn't measure up to the Hellfire clubs.
Really?
Oh yeah, you know.
Didn't they also have? I mean, you had tallying sticks, right, which were in existence up until about 1830, which was sort of like a 15th or 16th century version of something like Bitcoin, right?
I don't want to get obscure here. You know, you had one bubble after another. You had it in Paris, the Mississippi bubble. You had the tulip bubble. You had the, you know, the whole economy. It was like Wall Street. Cocaine, you know, drugs, prostitution. Hey, that's how it ran. You know, it was based on speculation, gambling, debauchery. That was the crown. That was slave trade.
Opium wars.
You know, so this is what even before it got the worst as it got it worse. This was what John Winthrop was already talking about, you know, in 1630.
This is what the Puritans are unhappy about.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's what human beings should be unhappy about, right? So it's not to be lived with, you know. So there was a belief in a higher purpose, right, and a different concept of man, that this is not what we were meant to be, and yeah, no, it it was bad. It was really bad. It was completely look. This was the period in which the British East India Company emerged, and the British Empire. The British Empire was the British East India Company. The armies of the British Empire were the armies of the British East India Company. They weren't directly under the crown. They were under the British East India Company. Right? That's the way it was organized. It was a companies that ran, and in the Dutch, it was the Dutch East India Company. They ran the show. You know, it's, in other words, this is, you want to talk about privatization? You know, these guys, you know, this is, you know, you're going back to what it was if you go down the route of deregulation and privatization. This is the way they ran the show before the American Revolution.
Does this include all the, you know, military exploits of the British Empire itself? I mean, including the wars in the 1600s and 1700s? Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, you had and mercenary soldiers from Germany and so on and so forth, right? I mean, this is all, you know, this is the way the show was run. I'm not saying every soldier, there may have been soldiers that were British soldiers of the line, so to speak, or whatever, but it was the British East India Company that overall actually fielded the armies, maintained the armies, used them to enforce their rule, you know, over the colonies, looted the colonies, paid off, you know, on the stock market, paid off to their investors, so on and so forth. This was a predatory Babylon, you know, regime process, and so this was the British Empire coming into existence in this period. So it's really worth sinking your tooth into the actual history of this period, including the internal life of London, merry old England at the time. You know, this is what happened to, this is what Shakespeare was trying to prevent. Well, if there's nothing more, we can just end today's show at this point. Thank you for being here. Thank you for